I gotta get into some China stuff here. Of course, the big news that we absolutely have to mention is Biden's, I guess, Gaffe. I'm not exactly sure. On his town hall with Anderson Cooper. I'm just gonna play it really quick here.
Greenwich. It's great. China just tested a hypersonic missile. What will you do to keep up with them militarily, and can you vow to protect Taiwan?
Yes and yes. We are militarily, China, Russia, and the rest of the world knows we have the most powerful military in the history of the world. Don't worry about whether they're going to be more powerful. What you do have to worry about is whether or not they're going to engage in activities that will put them in a position where they may make a serious mistake. And so I've spoken and spent more time with Xi Jinping than any other world leader has. That's why you hear people saying Biden wants to start a new Cold War with China. I don't want a Cold War with China. I just want to make China understand that we are not going to step back. We are not going to change any of our views.
So are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?
Yes, we have a commitment to do that.
All right, we're going to.
So that is quite the statement here, and let me explain why for people who aren't aware. The U.S. has a Taiwan's Relation Act where we say that there is a one China policy, that China and Taiwan are part of the same sovereign state, and that there should be a reunification, and the U.S. has a position of strategic ambiguity, whether it would actually come to the defense of Taiwan if it was attacked by China. And so Biden here is explicitly breaking that policy that's been in place from the Taiwan's Relation Act, a decades-long policy. I think it dates back to maybe Carter or possibly even Nixon, where the U.S. says that we're not explicitly going to come to the aid of Taiwan, although China don't even think about it because we might, and then it would be really difficult for you. And here you have Biden being asked by somebody and seeming to kind of confirm it, and then being asked explicitly by Anderson Cooper during this town hall and confirming it. Now, there were some other parts of this, and I'm not just bringing this up to dunk on the president and to be like, oh, look what a decrepit old man he is. But there's like a couple weird things that he does and says during this interview, and so maybe he's cognitively a little off here or something like that, and just is either missing the question or kind of understanding that what he's being asked here. Because we do get official statements later that kind of say that the U.S. policy isn't changing, but this did signal a change in U.S. policy, and was really concerning that Biden had said that. And so people immediately took to Twitter, even like Hots like Mad Spoot I saw tweeting out, oh boy, like we now have an interesting change to our policy here. And Biden didn't even seem to mention it or realize it, even when he was given an opportunity by Anderson Cooper to walk it back. And so the White House released a statement. Of course, Will Porter was absolutely great and on it within a few minutes, saying that the United States has not changed its policy on Taiwan. President Joe Biden was not announcing any change. The White House said on Thursday, after Biden vowed to come to the island's defense with a commitment to defend it. The U.S. defense relationship with Taiwan is guided by the Taiwans Relation Act, a White House spokesperson said. We will uphold our commitment under the act. We will continue to support Taiwan's self-defense, and we will continue to oppose any unilateral changes of the status quo. And so, yeah, that has long been the U.S. policy on the issue, and the White House spokesperson then has to come out and spin after Biden makes this gaffe. Now, it is somewhat reminiscent of me to what he said in an interview I think it was on CBS or something pretty early in his presidency. He was asked about Iranian enrichment and said no, none was allowed. Although I think this is a far more significant and problematic gaffe to make. This is going to really upset the Chinese leadership, and we've already seen that. There's an article from The Hill on the fallout here. We did have statements in the following day by the White House press secretary Jen Psaki and Lloyd Austin on this. Now, I will say none of the White House statements from the administration seem to really be a strong and firm walking back of what Biden said, which I think would have helped the situation with China a little bit. However, they did say that the U.S. policy against China hasn't changed, which I'm guessing China will understand is a signal. Now, here is the statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. They say, when it comes to issues related to China's sovereignty and territorial integrity and other core interests, there is no room for China to compromise or make concessions, and no one should underestimate the strong determination and firm, strong ability of the Chinese people to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, this was a pretty strong statement. I'm guessing that there's going to be some more responses from China, whether that's missile tests, whether that's joint exercises with Russia, and we'll get into that in a little bit later, or other maybe provocative things like flying flights closer and closer to Taiwan's actual airspace, but through Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which we have talked about in this show, stretches far out into, I think, the South China Sea and even over mainland China. But, when China flies through it, it is seen as provocative from the Taiwanese side. And it's a way I think that China has been showing how upset they are with the current status quo with the U.S.-Taiwan relationship recently. So, in the days leading up to that, I just want to highlight, too, that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was on a trip. I think he eventually ends up in Georgia after stopping in Ukraine, but here he is meeting with NATO, and he promised broad support and predictability and sustainability in the relationship with Russia, but he says that the U.S. has a resolute commitment to NATO and broad support for both Taiwan and the European Union. So even if, Biden's statement was overly bold, that, the U.S. was going to support Taiwan and everything like that, the U.S., through its action, through statements of other officials, have been making this policy more and more clear in the recent weeks. So, while, again, Biden, I really hope it was a gaffe, and I really hope the administration is at least making efforts through bad channels, like telling the Taiwanese, or the Chinese envoy or whatever, like, hey, we still have the same old policy. Biden just made a mistake. He was a little bit confused. We may defend Taiwan if you invade, but look, you're not going to invade anyway, so nobody has to worry about any of this, or something like that. However, there's reasons to doubt that'll work out, because Biden's ambassador to China, this from David Camp at antiwar.com, the nominee, so this is during his confirmation hearing, says China is the greatest threat to the U.S. and to the democratic world. And if this is the statement from the envoy, if this is the position of the, person who's supposed to be the communicator between the U.S. and China, then who knows if the, right signals are going to end up getting communicated. So right now he's not in that post, I understand, but just point out that these are the people that the Biden administration is bringing in and are currently in place to have diplomacy with China, are completely anti and rabidly so on the China issue. And, to an absurd level, saying like that China is the main enemy of democracy in the world. We claim we create democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan, where nobody votes anyways in those elections, and that they're just corrupt and create more terrible situations, and those states have committed tons of war crimes. Or in Israel, we create a democracy there where we have to help the Israelis keep the Palestinians out and keep their population numbers low enough to keep the, that state's the Jewish majority there. Like that, these aren't democracies. These are just states that are planned by the US and given the democracy label. And so, it's completely absurd what he's saying here. But that is Nicholas Burns, by the way, is the nominee, and he is the former ambassador to NATO. We also had in the past week, this before the Biden statement again, U.S. and Canadian warships sailing through the Taiwan Strait. For the U.S., it was a guided missile destroyer, a Burke class, the USS, let's see here, Dewey, and then the Canadian ship was the HMS Winnipeg, and that was a frigate. But you see, and especially if you listen to the show all the time, which you really should, of course, that the U.S. is rolling more nations. It recently was the UK, now it's Canada, into its transversing of the Taiwan Strait. So, of course, there's so much the U.S. is doing to provoke China. Of course, people are making a big deal of China's recent hypersonic missile test. I will say that I remain skeptical of the success of this test. If anybody wants to know why, it's my general position on hypersonic missiles, and there's a great article by Andrew Coburn. It's in the London Review of Books. I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in hypersonic missiles, where he discusses the scientific limitations of the technology at this time and the reason why, he's not exactly optimistic that states are close to developing these things. And so that was the reason for my take on the North Korean recent alleged hypersonic missile test, as well as this Chinese one. However, it is possible that China is developing hypersonic missiles. That being said, it's not going to give China a first strike capability against the U.S. The U.S. has several nuclear submarines that China has no idea where they are. They're loaded up with dozens, scores of nuclear weapons on each and every one of them, enough to wipe out millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese people should China carry out a first strike nuclear attack against the U.S. So this doesn't really change necessarily like the balance of power between the U.S. and China or anything like that. Now it does make the U.S. missile defense systems that we're spending trillions of dollars on less relevant, but the U.S. should look at this not as a really a problem for we got to spend more money on missile defense and developing our own hypersonic missiles, but rather, a need to start to negotiate arms defense deals and arms restrictions deals with Russia, with China, engage in talks with North Korea, and just let's stop carrying out these tests and not waste trillions of dollars on it after we just wrecked all of our economies. Let's not waste a whole bunch of our time, our brightest minds, sinking money in to these technologies that at the very best, the very best case, if you develop a hypersonic missile with a nuclear warhead, is that thing sits there and collects dust forever, because if it gets used, it's going to kill everyone. So those are, just some of the problems with, these kind of tests. Now, it's worth noting that the U.S. is carrying out our own test here. Now, there was one failed test, and this came, I believe, like mid-October. But then there were 3 more tests that the U.S. government says were successful. The failed test was apparently due to a booster, and I think that was actually the test of a hypersonic missile system, whereas the successful tests were only for components of these missiles. So that's what's going on here. We're spending so much money. Just want to talk about that a little bit because, it is important when you talk about the U.S.-Chinese relationship to understand that, at least from the Chinese perspective, if the U.S. defense budget is increasing, they're going to see that, at least their hots in that country are going to spin that as a threat. Just like the hots in our country are like, oh my God, China's going to spend $10 billion on hypersonic missiles. Well, the amount of money that the U.S. is spending on our military is absolutely absurd. We had the NDAA pass the House, which included, I think, about a 5% increase in overall defense spending. The Senate Dems won a 5% increase, but the GOP in the party is actually looking for a 13% increase. They want to bring the baseline Pentagon budget up to $788 billion next year. This is absolutely absurd, and this effort is being led by the ranking member, so that's the top Republican Republican of the Armed Services Committee, and that's Richard Shelby. I think he's from Alabama. All right. Now, there's a few things going on that I think are largely in counter and reaction to the very aggressive and hostile U.S. policy towards both China and Russia. And as we saw, Chinese and Russian ships do a joint sail through the Japanese Strait. This is the waterway between, and I guess it's international water, between the Chinese mainland and then its northern island. Now, I'm not really an expert on Japan. It seems like that these countries have carried out this kind of thing individually, but not as a joint thing. And I believe these ships were a part of the group of Japanese and Russian ships that end up holding joint patrols in the Western Pacific. Now, there's a lot of reasons that Russia and China are not natural allies. There's a lot of distrust there, and even territorial issues between the two countries. But the U.S. position and aggression has led these two countries to kind of realize that one of the ways that they could maybe put themselves in a better position is to at least unite against the U.S. And we're seeing that through these particular naval drills, and also drills that I've covered in the past, like in Chinese territory, I believe.